What is continental philosophy, and how does this term relate to what's known as the divide between analytic and continental philosophy in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy? I'm Professor Ellie Anderson, a philosopher and co-host of Overthink podcast. I was trained in a continental philosophy program, and I am here to tell you about this divide, which some people say doesn't exist, but I will show you why it does exist and why we need to talk about it. So continental philosophy is kind of a weird term because it refers to the European continent, and it's not descriptive beyond that. So it just sort of is like this strange term referring to the European continent, doesn't seem particularly useful. It actually originated in the mid-20th century, and it was coined by another group of philosophers called Analytic philosophers. In the middle of the 20th century, there had been this rise of various schools of analytic philosophy, such as logical positivism, philosophies that are really emphasizing logical argumentation, methodological rigor, inspired by math and science to do this. And at the same time, in the middle of the 20th century, there is this concern about philosophy that is overtly social and political because of the Red Scare. This is the McCarthy era, where there's a lot of concern in higher education that people are being taught communist values. And a lot of the European philosophers at the time were overtly communist or socialist, or at least inspired by Marx. And some of them, including Heidegger, were Nazis. So there was this attempt in Britain and the US to reject all of that philosophy, which seemed dangerous or potentially the target of educational cuts or firings or more dangerous aspects associated with the McCarthy era, and a sense that, well, actually, all we're doing over here in the philosophy department is just thinking about the truth of propositions. So there was a kind of delimiting of the scope of philosophy, driven in part by social and political motivations. And this delimitation really gets codified in 1962 when there is the establishment of SPEP, the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, as an alternative to the APA, the American Philosophical Association. All of these people who worked on philosophy that was inspired by the work that was going on in Europe at the time, phenomenology, existentialism were really the main two areas, but also like social, political philosophy, no longer felt like they had a place in the American Philosophical Association. And so then they moved to create their own organization called SPEP, which exists to this day. I've presented at it many times. It's the second biggest philosophy association in the US. And so continental philosophy was originally meant to refer mainly to existentialism and phenomenology. I would recommend a New York Times article on this by Gary Gutting, as well as Simon Critchley's book, Continental Philosophy, and Simon Glendinning's the book, The Idea of Continental Philosophy, if you want more on this divide, the origins of it from a historical perspective. But yeah, at the time, it was mostly referring to existentialism and phenomenology. And in the 1950s, analytic philosophy largely referred to logical positivism and ordinary language philosophy, which are by now no means the scope of analytic philosophy. It has a much bigger scope. Again, a lot of analytic philosophers today are working on social and political issues, even though that wasn't really seen as within the purview of analytic philosophy at the time. Those philosophers, as analytic philosophers, were actually largely not doing metaphysics even, or addressing fundamental ontological issues, let alone ethics and social political philosophy. Babette Babich, who's a contemporary continental philosophy, asserts that nowadays, now that there's been a sort of openness to those types of areas within analytic philosophy, there's a co-opting of continental philosophy by people who are working on topics that were usually addressed by continental philosophers. And they were like, that doesn't count. We're going to do it our own way. And Linda Martine Alcoff has some really interesting reflections on the analytic continental divide too. She asserts in her 2012 APA presidential address on what she calls the civil war between analytic and continental philosophy, that recent work in continental philosophy insists on the influence that power and desire exert on knowing, whereas contemporary analytic philosophy largely ignores these political concerns in its account of justification and truth. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the contents of what distinguishes analytic and continental philosophy, which I'll say more about and I have a lot of ideas about. But I think what is really interesting about Alcoff's view there, which is the reason that I mention it sort of in giving an initial historical trajectory of the difference, is that continental philosophy recognizes power dynamics and doesn't think of knowing as a neutral operation. Whereas contemporary analytic philosophy, even as it's starting to attend a bit more, I think, to this theme, largely ignores this concern in favor of a neutral account of knowledge, justification, and truth. So, having said that basically the term continental philosophy is a term created by outsiders or people who wanted to exclude continental philosophy from philosophy, it's not a very helpful or descriptive term because it just refers to like the European continent. So it's not really a thing in a sense. And as a result, some say that the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy is not relevant. However, I do think continental philosophy is a thing. I'm all for rejecting the dichotomy, and I would love to see a day when we can get rid of it altogether. But I do think that it is a very real dichotomy that exists in academia today in the US. I know this firsthand from having been on the philosophy job market for years and applying to jobs that are literally called continental philosophy jobs, and then meeting people who sometimes didn't really think that what I did was philosophy in the true sense, which is ironic for reasons I'll talk about. I think we need to do sort of what Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak talks about as the strategic essentialism. We need to strategically mobilize the term continental philosophy, even though it's not a very good term, it's the one that we have right now, identify what the specific methods are of what we might call continental philosophy, aside from just saying it's this unhelpful term that refers to the European continent, and then figure out ways to overcome the divide from there. And a starting point is that I actually think we need more continental philosophy, not less, by just rejecting the term. Especially because a lot of students don't even know what the distinction between continental and analytic philosophy is. And when they realize there is such a distinction, they realize that the kind of philosophy that they've been drawn to has been continental. And they don't know that in the US, continental philosophy is very much in the minority and is wrongfully seen as a specific area of philosophy when actually it's really, really broad. Another place you see the divide is in graduate programs, which generally are either analytic or continental. Okay, so what are the varying methods of continental philosophy and how do these differ from analytic philosophy? Well, continental philosophy is sometimes seen as the slightly unhinged cousin of analytic philosophy, which could not be further from the truth. Many have rightly noted, however, that continental philosophy has more in common with poetry and literature, while analytic philosophy has more in common with mathematics. So for instance, if you are reading a dialogue written by Plato in a class taught by somebody who's trained in continental philosophy, you're probably going to see a lot of attention to the sentence setting of the dialogue, in addition to a focus on the arguments. You're probably not going to hear that professor refer to Plato's theory of forms because Plato himself never articulates a theory of forms in his own name. It's an idea that he presents through Socrates, and continental philosophers tend to be very mindful of the historical and textual elements of a text, such that they want to avoid just thinking of Socrates as Plato's mouthpiece. Now, if you're in an analytic philosophy class reading one of Plato's dialogues, you may find that the professor breaks down the argument in logical notation on the board, and that's your primary way of dealing with the text. Say, for instance, trying to find out if the argument is valid and or sound, right? Like, is this a good argument? I think there's going to be more focus on the validity and soundness than you would find in a class on Plato that's being taught by a continental philosopher, although there's also going to be a focus on the content of the arguments involved. So in addition to the straightforwardly historical origin of the term continental philosophy that I talked about at the beginning of the video, philosophers have different ways of thinking about the methodological origins of the divide between analytic and continental philosophy. One of the narratives that I heard when I was a student is that the origins of this divide can be traced back to modern philosophy, especially 17th and 18th century philosophy, between empiricism on the one hand and rationalism on the other hand. Empiricism is the view that knowledge comes from the senses, and rationalism is the view that knowledge comes from reason. According to this narrative, analytic philosophy would have its origins in empiricism, where there's a strong emphasis on observation and more generally just an emphasis on epistemology, or the study of knowing, the theory of knowledge. Continental philosophy, according to this view, would originate in rationalism's emphasis on speculation, pertaining most to metaphysics. But I've also heard other versions of the story. So some trace it to Kant's distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, saying that Post-Kantian philosophy that focuses on analytic judgments becomes analytic philosophy, and post-Kantian philosophy interested in synthetic judgments develops into continental philosophy. I've also heard that the distinction emerges from the dispute between logical positivism and phenomenological ontology, as evinced by the bitter dispute between Carnap and Heidegger. Whatever the narrative is, there's a weird asymmetry between the term continental and analytic philosophy, because as I said, the term continental only refers to a geographic area, and the term analytic actually does refer to a method, or maybe like an umbrella term for a set of methods. And I think this sometimes leads one to think that continental philosophy is a subfield of philosophy, which is quite a misguided notion, in my opinion. Most so-called subfields of philosophy are defined by specific areas of inquiry, as in the case of ethics and aesthetics, or by their methods in the case of logic. And maybe analytic philosophy, although I want to be kind of agnostic about whether that refers to a method or set of methods, or perhaps it doesn't even. But continental philosophy is not defined by either an area or by a method. It covers a wide range of areas of inquiry, and it houses a plethora of methods. Existentialism, phenomenology, but more recently, post-structuralism, object-oriented ontology, what else have we got? Dialectical materialism, other kinds of dialectics, other kinds of materialism, hermeneutics, and so on and so on. It's not a subfield at all, even though it's been treated as such. And yet, I also think that there are some themes, let's say, that we can attend to in continental philosophy that help us gain a rich sense of what this kind of philosophy offers, such that we need to amplify it in contemporary American academia and ultimately overcome the continental analytic divide, which again, I do want to overcome, but I think we need to strategically mobilize the term continental philosophy in order to get there, because the situation right now is so asymmetrical, so uneven, frankly, so messed up. And the strategic mobilization, I think, means giving an account of what characterizes the theories that are termed continental, even as we grant that they are heterogeneous. And before I do this, let me just be even a little bit clearer about why I think it is important to do this. So the most pressing reason is the conditions in which American philosophers find themselves. These are the conditions of the contemporary university, including the abysmal job market, an increasing emphasis on adjunct labor, the sidelining of the humanities, the interest in diversifying philosophy, which is historically a very white and a very male discipline, and the bureaucratization of academic philosophy. I think after all, the situation for continental philosophy today is quite dire. Faced with extreme pressures from university bureaucracies and frequent attacks on the humanities, philosophy departments have felt the need to center extraordinarily practical skills. And continental philosophy, which is considered esoteric, even though it precisely encapsulates those areas of the discipline that allow us to criticize those demands towards like practical applicability, etc., has in some departments been edged out entirely. And other departments, even including prominent continental graduate departments, have felt the need to hire more analytic philosophers in order to show that they are, sort of catering to these demands of neoliberalism. And this even goes for sometimes so-called specialists in continental philosophy, these people who are actually not trained in continental philosophy, but like maybe wrote a dissertation on Foucault out of an analytic department. I feel kind of salty about this. Obviously, as you can say, my experience on the job market was a little bit of a show. So just as an example, in 2021, only 1.2% of tenure-track jobs in philosophy were in continental philosophy. That's according to the Philosopher's Cocoon, which does a big study of all of this. Sure, the job market is bad for everyone, and there is this really nefarious emphasis on contingent labor, such as adjunct labor and frequent budget cuts, other threats to the humanities. But I do think continental philosophy seems to be getting iced out, while far more specific subfields of the discipline are seeing far greater numbers of jobs. So for instance, even as continental philosophy comprised just 1.2% of the jobs in 2021, philosophy of science comprised 11.7%. Even as philosophy of science is a far more niche area of philosophy if we're speaking of scope than continental philosophy is. And while we're at it, we might as well address the fact that most job advertisements that do not explicitly request continental philosophy are not going to continentally trained philosophers. In my experience, pretty much every other job advertisement implicitly has analytic in parentheses before it. Ethics, don't bother applying if your work is on Levinas. Social and political philosophy, if you're addressing Adorno rather than Rawls, Okay, the committee is apt to find your work pretty much unintelligible. And while positions in feminist philosophy and philosophy of race tend to be a bit friendlier to continental philosophers, there's still a bias in favor of analytic philosophy, which is especially odd because continental programs are often far stronger on philosophy of race and gender than analytic programs are. For those continental philosophers who do get invited for job interviews, we learn very quickly that the prerequisite of the job is being able to translate your work into analytic terms. After all, for most jobs, practically everyone interviewing us is somewhere on the spectrum of ignorant to hostile toward continental philosophy. Granted, continental philosophers are accustomed to translating, right? Many of us work in languages other than English and on thinkers who conceive of philosophy as deeply bound up with the task of translating. But there's a difference between recognizing that all philosophy has a component of translation and being expected to translate your work from one idiom into another just to be considered intelligible, to avoid the charges of speaking nonsense, or worse, to not be doing philosophy at all. So these conditions of the job market, I think, are what have most strongly catalyzed me to wanting to strategically mobilize the term continental philosophy in order to seek a future where this distinction is no longer relevant. And I have more pragmatic ideas for how we might achieve this overcoming. But in the rest of this video, I want to do what I've been promising for a while now, which is actually talk a little bit about how I might describe continental methods such that we can say, even though this is not a subfield or a specific area within philosophy, in the true sense, it might perform that way, but I don't think truly speaking it is. There is some coherence to the heterogeneous methods of continental philosophy that I think are really, really important for philosophy to keep in mind today. And maybe we might even call these tendencies rather than themes. So the first tendency is the questioning of common sense. Those of us who teach philosophy are all too familiar with students that think that theory should be guided by common sense. Indeed, I used to be one of these students. But studying with continental philosophers has taught me that this prejudice in favor of common sense is actually quite dangerous. Through my encounters with philosophers such as Foucault, Adorno, and Arrighi, I came to understand common sense as a tip of an iceberg that I had never before detected. And this tip of the iceberg that is common sense, I think, is related to the whole iceberg underneath, which we might call ideology. Studying continental philosophy often reveals that beneath common sense are a giant mass of implicit beliefs, organizing principles, and general structures of society, material structures, for instance, that lie beneath the surface of discourse and of thinking. We see this questioning of common sense in the genealogical methods of Nietzsche and Foucault. It's also at work in the ideology critique of the Frankfurt School, as well as the deconstruction of Derrida and the epoche, or bracketing, of phenomenology. Such approaches as these have various ways of understanding how to question common sense, right? It's not as if they have a one-size-fits-all approach, and also what it means to do so. But these different approaches all recognize that common sense is the tip of the iceberg. And in this sense, they differ from analytic methods of philosophy, which stick to analyzing that part of the iceberg that is above the water. So take, for instance, the common appeal in analytic philosophy to intuitions. In a 2012 article for the New York Times' very sadly now defunct philosophy blog, The Stone, Gary Gutting identifies the appeal to common sense intuitions as a major characteristic of analytic philosophy, as opposed to continental philosophy. Analytic arguments, for instance, often begin by pointing out intuitions and then probing them using logical inference. Intuitions are also offered frequently as objections against arguments, as in when an argument is discounted by virtue of not being intuitive. I hear this a lot, and I find it so strange. Continental methods, by contrast, recognize that intuitions say more about the accepted parameters of thought within a given context than they do about truth. Intuitions may be very, very useful starting points, but they become destabilized as we realize what they cover up and obscure. And this destabilization is important because I think philosophy can only become emancipatory when it can challenge us to emancipate ourselves from common sense. Related to this questioning of common sense is the second feature of continental philosophy, to my mind, which is hermeneutic methods. If we take hermeneutics in the broad sense of a study of interpretation, we see it running through any philosophy that recognizes that words do not transparently express thoughts and that translation is a fundamental task of philosophy. As a philosopher, Paul Ricoeur writes, interpretation, I'm going to quote him here, is the work of thought which consists in deciphering the hidden meaning in the apparent meaning, in unfolding the levels of meaning implied in the literal meaning, end quote. That's from his Conflict of Interpretations. This process of deciphering and unfolding is ongoing and requires a deep sensitivity to otherness or alterity. Another hermeneutic philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, writes that hermeneutic work is based on a polarity of familiarity and strangeness, and this polarity doesn't exist in the psyche or mind of the interpreter, but rather in the very subject matter studied. For Gadamer, this subject matter was the text. For Foucault, it was institutions such as prisons and madhouses, and for Heidegger, it was predicative language, instrumental reasoning, and so on. Here again, the methods of continental philosophy can be usefully contrasted with analytic methods, which again, I'm not saying are bad, but I'm saying that they are limited and that they need to recognize that there are other valid methods as well. Many continental philosophers share a suspicion of what's known as the correspondence theory of truth, which is the idea that truth is the correspondence between a belief and a state of affairs out there in the world, right? This kind of correspondence between internal and external. But the suspicion of the correspondence theory of truth in continental philosophy often goes hand in hand with a questioning of the relation between beliefs and the language that is used to express them. In much analytic philosophy, language is presumed to have a direct relation to beliefs and other states of mind. Language transparently expresses states of mind. This means that language ideally should communicate as clearly as possible, and the norm of clarity is thus taken in analytic philosophy as an obvious good. However, thinkers in the continental tradition, such as Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Adorno, point out that the dogma of clarity brings with it a whole host of philosophical assumptions that should be subject to scrutiny, such as the correspondence theory of truth that I mentioned above. Adorno has this essay called Skotenos, or How to Read Hegel, where he points out that clarity has in the 20th century become autonomous from the philosophies in which it originated, most notably Descartes' philosophy. So Descartes had this desire for clear and distinct ideas, which he took from mathematics, and this trickled down from philosophy into the natural sciences and has persisted there, only to trickle back into philosophy, or back up to philosophy, if we want to say that metaphor, I don't know, with the rise of positivism. Adorno writes, and this is a quote from Adorno, from Skotenos, "The concept of clarity is taken from individual disciplines in which it has been preserved as dogma, and reapplied to a philosophy that long ago subjected it to critical reflection, and therefore ought not to have complied with it unquestioningly," end quote. So under the pressure of logical positivism, analytic philosophy has fetishized clarity, even as philosophy for at least 200 years, I'm thinking about Hegel as an example, has provided ample reasons to be skeptical about it, to say that actually maybe correspondence between a belief and a state of affairs isn't the way that truth works, or isn't the way that knowledge works, and definitely isn't the way that we relate to the world. It's a lot more complicated than that. So continental philosophy is often accused of being unclear, and this is often because the ideas propounded precisely rebel against the metaphysical assumptions that clear expression brings with it. So I think that even though in some cases it is right to say that continental philosophy can be unclear, there's a lot of continental philosophy that is self-consciously so, and because it recognizes the limitations of the norm of clarity. Even though I think this is not always true, there can be some unclear continental philosophy that is unclear not in a good way. Like, I think Husserl, great thinker, terrible writer, he could have used some writing training. But as Adorno notes, Hegel disavows hypotactical writing in favor of parataxis. So in paratactical writing, the structure of sentences undermines the hierarchy of clauses as well as subjects and predicates. Instead, meaning in a paratactical sense emerges through the relation of clauses and sentences to one another. And this is very indicative of Hegel's own dialectical method, according to Adorno. So Hegel's way of writing, which is sometimes accused of being unclear, Adorno thinks is that way for a reason, because he's interested in the fact that meaning emerges out of the relation between clauses and sentences rather than through a kind of classical subject-predicate propositional form. So Adorno, too, employs paratactical writing in an effort to resist what he calls identity thinking and the fetish of clarity. Another of the many continental questioners of clarity is, of course, Nietzsche. At the end of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche laments that the recording of thoughts immortalizes what is fleeting and deadens what was once so dynamic and forceful. All of the novelty and freshness of thought is lost when it is written, according to Nietzsche. In writing, the butterfly of thought is killed and pinned down, and this loss of life is irrevocable. Thought can no longer be in flight once it is held down and the shape and color of its wings are analyzed. Nietzsche is a lover of creativity, novelty, vigor, and multiplicity, and he struggles in his work with his commitment to the values of dynamism, chaos, and novelty on the one hand, and the narrowness of language on the other, his awareness that they are not easily communicable through the narrow constraints of language. Nietzsche struggles in his work with his commitment to the values of dynamism, chaos, and novelty, and his awareness that they are not easily communicable within the constraints of language on the other. Furthermore, Nietzsche actually directly opposes clarity, and he states in Beyond Good and Evil, a matter that becomes clear ceases to concern us. So for him, clarity is the sign of a lifeless concept. When philosophy is clear, it is not generative. This leads me to the third tendency that I'm identifying in continental philosophy, which is concept creation. And I'm taking this term from Deleuze and Guattari in their book, What is Philosophy? They take inspiration in that book from Nietzsche to suggest that philosophy is a discipline that involves creating concepts. And for them, this means that philosophy is an art. Specifically, it is the art of, quote, forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts, end quote. And I think this is another aspect of the contention that philosophy is to art what analytic philosophy is to mathematics. So for instance, Beauvoir's concept of ambiguity, Fanon's concept of the racial epidermal schema, Hegel's concept of spirit are all inventions that organize phenomena and unlock ways of being and thinking in the world. Granted, not all continental philosophers would embrace the idea that they are inventing concepts. Derrida, for instance, on whom I wrote my dissertation, repeatedly insists that terms such as difference and the trace are not concepts. So some of his central contributions to philosophy, he says, are not concepts. But I would venture to say that even this kind of resistance attests to the vision of philosophy as invention that Deleuze and Guattari address. Because their view of philosophy as creation of concepts doesn't imply that the philosopher comes up with concepts ex nihilo and that those concepts are fully encapsulated by a given definition or term. Instead, the philosopher, they say, is the friend of the concept, playing on this notion that philosophy is the love of wisdom and the philosopher is the friend of wisdom that you find in the Greek etymology. To be the friend of the concept means to recognize that its invention is not the act of a sheer solitary genius, but rather an event that can be said to be autopoietic. They say, for instance, Deleuze and Guattari, that the concept posits itself to the same extent that it is created. As Derrida notes, invention is always the invention of the other. Now for the fourth tendency, which is grafting. Though the creation of a concept is an event, its creation has been prepared by much that seems to pre-exist it. For one thing that continental philosophy teaches is that concepts have histories and processes of becoming. Honoring this is partly a matter of uncovering the hidden histories of ideas, which I think is partly why continental philosophy programs tend to emphasize the history of philosophy a lot more than analytic programs. And we've already mentioned this a bit in mentioning some hermeneutics. But another part is explicitly naming the ideas and thinkers on whose shoulders we stand. And this leads me to the fourth tendency, which is grafting. So I don't remember exactly when in graduate school this metaphor came to me, and possibly it came from someone else, which would be a true example of grafting. But I've often thought about the difference between continental and analytic philosophy as the difference between ground clearing and grafting. Analytic philosophy seeks to uproot weeds, clean up all the debris, and start from a firm, stable foundation that is universally communicable. One of the admirable aspects of this method is that it seeks to do away with artifacts or illusions of thought, to get things right. But this tendency toward ground clearing has led to a common bias in analytic philosophy against really working through the ideas of philosophers from previous eras of history, especially through their writings. So for instance, I spoke with a prominent analytic philosopher a few years ago, schooled at some of the best analytic programs in the world, who told me he'd gone into philosophy because philosophy required the least amount of reading of any of the humanities. And this was a clear case to me that there is a really stark difference between the training of analytic graduate programs and continental graduate programs. Because my comprehensive examinations at Emory University, where I did my PhD, required reading 60 books from the history of philosophy and writing a total of around 150 pages on them to demonstrate comprehension. So continental philosophy recognizes that failing to read the history of philosophy means reinventing the wheel, if not woefully misrepresenting the nature of thought and opening oneself up to the seduction of what Socrates calls misology. Of course, continental philosophy's emphasis on grafting can become a stumbling block. For one, the fetishization of the canon of Western philosophy especially can lead to an unfairly limited sense of the concepts that we can use in grafting, leading the work of many thinkers outside of this narrow canon to be perpetually overlooked. In addition, continental philosophers can sometimes fall into the illusion that a combination of ideas is interesting simply because the thinkers who've said them are well known. And continental philosophy is sometimes rightly accused of lapsing into idol worship. Certainly, the idea that one must draw on the existing ideas of well-known thinkers can discourage bold originality. And so this is something that I've been kind of working to counteract in my years post-graduate school. The philosopher Rainer Schermann once said that continental philosophers sometimes behave like journalists, merely reporting on the ideas of other thinkers. Here, creativity withers, and I think sometimes if we are journalists, like, we're bad ones, so we should be careful about that and not just think that philosophy is the same as reporting on the ideas of more famous thinkers. It's one thing to teach those famous thinkers, but another to just report on what they've said in our writing and scholarship. But at the same time, reading widely within philosophy allows thinkers to do the work of grafting. So in horticulture, grafting is the act of joining two or more plants together in order to create a new variety. My dissertation director, Cynthia Willett, calls this the act of creative juxtaposition. Take, for instance, Judith Butler's concept of performativity. This concept is the result of combining three philosophical ideas. I have a video on this as well if you're interested. First, the idea of acts from the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. Second, Simone de Beauvoir's notion of gender as a process of becoming. And third, the theory of performative utterance that one finds in speech act theory. Butler explicitly lays out this lineage in the 1988 essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, which lays the groundwork for Gender Trouble, which came out 2 years later. The notion of performativity, which has been perhaps the most generative concept for contemporary gender theory, is itself a graft, and a graft that originates in continental philosophy. These four threads of continental philosophy that I've identified are not meant to be exhaustive, and I also think that they should be taken with a grain of salt. There's an extent to which even coming up with such a list that brings together the various traditions that characterize a term given to us by the ignorant is already ceding ground and doing the work of translating that I critiqued above. But I also think that there is value in making explicit some of the many approaches that our subdiscipline offers. I see it as part of giving an account, a logos, under the non-ideal conditions in which we find ourselves. If there is something of storytelling here, so much the better.